Back in the late 1970s, my mom worked for the city of Pensacola, Florida. She usually worked the late shift. One night she had to print out some reports. At the time, the printers were those giant matrix printers that printed on the giant green and white striped paper and were located in a separate building. One night in particular, she stepped out of the main building to walk over to the other building to get the reports. She noticed 3 cars in the parking lot: hers, the security guard, and an orange Volkswagen Bug. She didn't recognize the Bug, and at first thought someone else was working late. As she was heading towards the other building, a man steps out of the Bug, with his left arm wrapped up in a makeshift sling. He asks her if she could drive him to the hospital. She said she couldn't, but she'd call an ambulance for him. He's very persistent, and she agrees, after the end of her shift. She gets the reports, then walks back to the main building. The guy's just standing there, getting more anxious. My mom calls the security guard, but the guy leaves before the guard could get there. A week later, Ted Bundy would be arrested at Oscar Werner's Pancake House in Pensacola, Florida. I was traveling in Nicaragua several years ago when I got lost and ended up having to take a taxi at 9:30 p.m. back to my hostel. When the taxi pulled up to the curb, the driver locked the doors and told me that I had misunderstood the fare. He claimed I owed him $100, which was several times more than we had agreed upon. I tried to pry the doors open from the inside but was completely trapped. Thankfully, he let me out of the taxi after taking all the money I had on me. The hostel workers told me I was incredibly lucky. A few days earlier, a taxi driver had kidnapped another young female, assaulted her, then dumped her barely conscious body in a field outside town, thinking that she was dead. A few local schoolchildren found her on their way to school in the morning. This happened with my mom, way before she was married to my dad. She went on a blind date one day. Her date took her to a restaurant, and although he was nice enough, she just wasn't into him. Not even halfway through the meal, she was already thinking of ways to leave early. While my mom's date was in the restroom, the waiter approached her and asked her if she was okay. She explained she was on a blind date and not having much fun. Turns out, the waiter was just about to get off work. He offered to give her a ride home if she waited another 10 minutes. She considered it, and was about to say yes, when her date came back from the restroom. She gave a subtle head shake saying no to the waiter and smiled. She and her date finished their meals, and he took her home. The next night, my mom was watching the evening news. A story comes on about a woman being roped and murdered behind a restaurant the night before. The restaurant was the one she had been at. They showed the murderer's picture. It was the waiter. Back in the 70s, my grandfather dropped my grandmother, Mom, and her 2 sisters off to do some shopping on his way to work. Since he wasn't able to pick them up, they hitchhiked home. My mom at the time was only around 10 or 11, middle sister would have been about 7 or 8, and the youngest was about a year old. They get picked up by a guy in pickup truck, who has them all sit in the back row with one of them holding the baby. My grandmother was giving directions to their home from a highway, but the guy ignored her and went by their exit claiming he had to make a stop first. Didn't really say much else to them during the drive. My mom remembers my grandmother being very quiet and very nervous. Eventually they come up to a farm. Driver tells them to wait in the car and goes inside the house. While he's gone, they just sit there terrified. They're in the middle of nowhere and know they couldn't make it out on foot. A few minutes later, the driver comes out with a second guy who looks into truck and sees my mom's youngest sister. He starts flipping out, screaming at the driver that he shouldn't have brought the baby back, they aren't going to do anything with her, and some other things I can't remember, and ends up telling him to get them away from the farm. Driver gets back into the truck, apologizes, and they get back on the highway and drive again in silence. My grandmother, normally a very smart woman, had him drive directly to their house, although I suspect her reasoning was, She'd already given him the address before anything seemed off. They lived at that house for several years and luckily never saw either of them a second time. My buddies and I went camping by the lake one night. At around 1:30 a.m., we heard some rustling in the bushes and just figured it was a rabbit or something. We went over to check it out but found nothing. At about 1:35 a.m., a huge pickup truck blaring loud music drove by on a dirt road, really slowly, shining a huge police-grade spotlight on me and my friends. The truck burned out and kept driving, so my best friend and I decided to drive up the road and see if we could spot anything unusual about the truck. We get to the main road and there are probably 7 or 8 cop cars and 2 or 3 ambulances. We stop to turn around and I swear like a damn horror film, a cop pecks on my window with this flashlight out of nowhere. He asks what we're doing and we told him we were camping and told him about the truck. He says, "You boys might want to camp somewhere else. We had a homicide here and haven't located the suspect yet." We tore back down to the campsite and called the rest of our buddies and told them to pack up the gear and not to ask questions and that we had to get out. We literally threw 2 fully pitched tents into the back of one of the trucks and got the hell out of there. The cops located the killer about 30 minutes later. At our campsite. When I was a baby, my dad played on a softball team. Typical, out for beers and pizza, family event type thing. My parents were good friends with 2 of the other couples, both of them had young kids as well. On this occasion, the other 2 couples had left their kids at one of their houses, with a babysitter they were splitting. They invited my parents back to the house to have some more beers that night, but I was being fussy and my mom nixed the idea. Though they would 100% have normally gone back to hang out. When the other parents got back to the house, they walked in on a home invasion. 2 men had broken in, tied up the kids and the babysitter, and her boyfriend, and were waiting for the parents. Took the parents hostage as well, and made the dads drive with them to banks, to clear out accounts. They then came back to the house, and slaughtered both families, the babysitter, and her boyfriend. Kids included. They caught the 2 guys later on. My dad attended the trials, and said it was the first time he had ever had thoughts of supporting the death penalty. It still gives me chills to know how close we came to getting killed that day too. My friend and I carpool to and from work together every day. It was late at night and I was waiting for her to come pick me up when her cousin drove past and told me she was running late, and had asked if he could come pick me up, so I wouldn't have to wait so long alone. I met her cousin only once, very briefly at a wedding she had dragged me to a few months back. He seemed nice, so I agreed. I was about to step into the car, but then I realized I had left my purse inside my work. I told him I would be 2 seconds to go grab it. I went back into work and grabbed my purse. My phone rang. It was my friend. She said she was on her way to come pick me up. Confused, I reminded her that she had asked her cousin to pick me up. Silence. She only has one cousin, and he was on a missionary trip in another country. Turns out, this guy had been stalking every detail of my life and schedule, and knew I waited for my friend every night to pick me up. He dressed up as my friend's cousin because he knew I wouldn't be afraid of him because I had met him, but I didn't know him well enough to realize it wasn't him. The cops after a long chase caught him. He had previously murdered 3 other women, and in the back of his car were guns, ropes, and masks. If you enjoyed your time here, please consider leaving a like on this video and subscribe to FearLore. And don't forget to share your thoughts on the comments section below. Thank you for watching.